Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our Ad Age webcast sponsored by NEUSTAR. The topic of today's webcast is Overcoming the Marketer's Identity Crisis, New Strategies for Omnichannel Success. I'm Christopher Hosford with the Ad Age team, and I'm here as your moderators today. We have just a few quick items to go over before we begin. We'll hear from today's presenters, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. To participate in the Q&A portion of the webcast, all you have to do is type your questions into the Ask a Question text area, and then click the Submit button. You can submit your questions at any time during the webcast, and we'll address as many of them as time permits after our presenters' prepared remarks. Please also note the series of widgets that are available to you at the bottom of the console. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Susan Ettlinger is Industry Analyst at Altimeter Group, a profit company. Susan promotes the strategic and ethical use of data and as well conducts independent research on these topics, advising global executives on data and analytics strategy. In addition, she works with technology innovators to help them to refine their roadmaps and go-to-market strategies. Susan also is on the board of the Big Boulder Initiative, an industry organization dedicated to promoting the successful and ethical use of data. She's a TED speaker, is regularly asked to speak on data strategy and best practices, and has been quoted in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the BBC. Along with Susan, we have Jascha Ulrich Stiermatt, Vice President of Product Marketing at NEUSTAR. Jascha brings more than 19 years of global experience in online advertising, digital media, and emerging technologies across product management, marketing, and business development. Previously, at Aggregate Knowledge, Jascha was responsible for creating the company's market position, value proposition, and differentiation, and defining the product roadmap. And at Microsoft, Jascha was involved in many of that company's key online advertising efforts, including strategies for the MSN US homepage and local edition. He holds an MBA in International Marketing and Strategy from the George Washington University. Now, let's get right to our webinar today, Overcoming the Marketer's Identity Crisis, New Strategies for Omnichannel Success. Jascha, I believe you're up first.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and good morning or hello to everybody on the webinar. Very excited to explore this topic since at least we've been talking about it and dealing with it for the last couple of years. So before we sort of get into the crisis and some of the solutions, what I thought I'd do is take a little step back and really discuss or lay out why identity matters. And at the core of it is what everybody knows, which is the increased customer touch points. And I like to sort of think about, at least it astonishes me, is to think about the fact that Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, WhatsApp, Snapchat, all of these channels and new channels have really come up in the last 10 years. I forgot to mention YouTube and the fact that now YouTube is even in the TV upfronts. And so when you think about the impact on managing a marketing mix and where to invest dollars, but also how to essentially have a personalized dialogue across all these touch points that I just laid out, both in the digital world, and now you lay in offline channels such as call center or your brick and mortar stores, and then on top of that, mobile devices and tablets. It really is a huge issue that marketers have to deal with in order to know who's at the other end of this conversation and how do I drive a consistent dialogue with my prospects. And so for us, when we think about the identity, why it matters, is that really what we're dealing with is partial information on our consumer or prospect. We get information, pretty good information on the digital side, although we'll talk about how that's not really always connected. We get some information on sort of offline purchases, and then there's sort of a whole other slew of information that we really don't, that marketers really don't have to complete the picture. And so what we really mean is that you need to layer on demographic purchase behaviors and consumer attitudes and lifestyle patterns to complete that picture. And what we're going to talk about is how to ensure that those data points are connected, and certainly how we ensure that we abide to privacy compliant guidelines, as well as make sure that we approach data in an ethical manner, because at the end of the day, it is your data that we're trying to leverage in this endeavor. And so now that we've sort of talked about why it matters, let's start talking about what consumer identity really is. In its crux, it is to create a single, accurate, and up-to-date view of a real person. And again, that really means that you need to include past and present identifiers, and we're going to go into that in a little bit. It means that you need to extend across a growing number of interaction points. You have to do all of this respecting express privacy preferences, and in our case, even being ahead of the curve in terms of privacy guidelines. And then to create, at the end of the day, a clear picture of the individual, the customers and prospects that you and marketers are trying to have a interaction with, and really with the ultimate goal of increasing the customer's long-term value over time. One of my favorite examples that I can think of now are all of the recorded interactions with call centers or customer service incidents that are going viral. And when you think about that, it sort of has shifted the consumer power, if you will, in the equation around those customer experiences. And so really every touch point is critical. You got to know who's at the end of that touch point. You got to make sure that you're giving the right offer, that you're giving the right service, and you know who is around there, because at any time the customer can really sort of control that relationship. So with that, I thought, Susan, I would love for you to elaborate more on sort of the multitude of data elements. You and I have had chats before around that to see what marketers should consider as they think about building this consumer identity.
Sure, Yasha, thanks so much. So folks, before we start to add some clarity and some focus to this, I'm going to widen the net even a little bit more, because when you think about all the data elements that Yasha just mentioned, then there are others as well that we sort of have to think about and figure out how to prioritize and layer on. So one of them would be community data. So are people participating in communities such as the Verizon or AT&T mobile community to find out questions about their phones and issues with their phones and issues with their calling plans? Are they the Sephora community where people write in about skincare products and cosmetics? Are they for example, the FICO community, which is actually around credit scoring and trying to help each other increase their credit scores? And so there's all sorts of data out there in communities, some of which are purpose-built by brands and some of which are actually more organic types of communities. Then there's social data, and of course this is just one big black box here, but Yasha just mentioned, all the different social networks, and of course there are even more if we think about things globally in terms of Line and in terms of WeChat and Snapchat, and we start thinking about messaging apps and all sorts of other stuff, which is, of course, very, very hard to interpret. Then we have things like enterprise collaboration data. And so for any of you who work inside large organizations that have maybe Chatter or Yammer or Cisco's Jabber and collaborate with each other using those, Slack, for example, all of that data is interesting because not only does it give you a sense of what the customer is saying externally, but it also can give you a sense of what is being done internally on topics that resonate externally. And so that could be really interesting in terms of trying to disambiguate a single person to understand what that person or what that group's issues may be. Then we go into business data, and again, this is one that includes many, many categories. So that would be things like customer relationship management. Yasha was talking about call center chat logs, things like that, business intelligence, market research, that would be customer satisfaction surveys, NPS focus groups, email marketing, the list goes on, and even to sensor data at some point in the future, and some companies are actually doing this now to connect the sensor data with the individual. And if you want a simple example, just think about the wearable fitness devices, which actually do connect the sensor data with the individual. And so then some, but not all of this data is mobile and available on mobile platforms. And of course, there you have different ways of identifying who people are, because obviously the phone has a MAC address, which is a unique identifying address. Then I talked about sensor data, and then finally there is econometric data. And now this doesn't have to do with identity at all. This actually has to do with issues beyond what's happening with an individual person or in an individual company. And econometric data would be things like interest rates and consumer buying behaviors and things like that, gas prices. So for example, if you're an automotive manufacturer, you might be concerned not only with what individual people are thinking and feeling and expressing and doing behaviorally, but you might want to triangulate that with what's happening with econometric data, because when you put a person's behavior in the context of the fact that interest rates just jumped or dropped, or gas prices just jumped or dropped, if you're a car manufacturer, that's obviously going to add some very important context. So we take all of that and add even a little bit more of a view on it, and now we start to try to understand it throughout what we call the customer journey or the consumer journey. And to be honest, I think all of you realize that not everything happens in this neat little cycle of 6 different ovals, that people jump back and forth, that they're communicating and behaving and clicking on websites and using apps and doing all sorts of things without really a linear progression. But there are ways in which we can start to understand some of these signals in the context of what we think of as a customer journey. So what tells us about whether someone is aware of a product, and there are all sorts of, think about that in the context of all the different data sources that Yasha and I just mentioned, or that they're considering, I'm thinking about buying a car, or I'm thinking about doing something, or I'm clicking through on a website and viewing a few different pages and actually staying, my dwell time is a little longer than it might be otherwise, all the way to purchase, and then to the experience, where many, when you think about things in terms of a marketing cloud or service cloud view, then of course you need that integration of that individual between their experience as a potential or actual buyer and their experience as a customer. And then we move into things like loyalty programs, where of course you have other data about people and what they've done over time. And loyalty programs, of course, being a great way to consolidate that data and also to disambiguate that identity. And then into things like advocacy, where potentially, the goal here, the vision here, is that you could start to bring not only this one person into focus, but actually the network that person has. And so the big, the BHAG idea here is that then you could start to see how that person potentially influences others. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Yasha to talk a little bit more about how these identifiers work and sort of how we sort of bring this back into focus.
No, this is great. Thank you, Susan. And it's a great sort of elaboration of even staying, as you said, casting the net wider. When we think about building an identity and helping, we think about sort of categorizing these into known interactions and those around a store interaction, direct mail, or email outreach, or call center interactions. And then oftentimes we have anonymous interactions. I think the last statistics I saw is about 55% of website visitors are anonymized. Mobile, we know that mobile is not really cookie based, so we go off of an ad ID. Social is a very great and big tool, but we also know a lot of people use different email addresses and social handles. And the point of it is that when we think about the customer journey and the data elements that Susan just laid out, this customer journey really goes back and forth, and we could do this complicated slide where consumers bounce back and forth between known and anonymous interactions. But at the end of what it does is that these interactions yield different kinds of identifiers. And when we talk about the identity crisis, it really is the challenge to unify all of this consumer data that we have on some, for the same person. And often I have conversations with folks where the CRM data is in one system managed by one team, the billing data is managed by a billing team, the direct mail or Marketo or whatever solutions that are out there for marketing automation sits in another team. Digital advertising technology, whether that is for the website or for media execution, also oftentimes sit in different systems. And that's a challenge that we face, and so the systems are not integrated. We're not sure if the PII information is up to date or not. And when we're trying to drive customers back, we don't know if they're customers or prospects, because a lot of times those interactions are limited. And we're going to go into the solutions, but I really wanted to leverage sort of in addition to the data management problem, I wanted to leverage Susan's work and research she's done in an additional problem or challenge that I think exists in the space, which is around the level of trust that companies have with the right use of their data. To whom can they trust? How are companies going to leverage the data, precious data, for the benefit, for their own benefit? And so let's touch on that if you don't mind, Susan, and you've done some great research there in that area.
Sure, I'm happy to. So just to kind of put a little bit of context around this, there are a couple of slides that you'll see here that are part of a report that I did earlier this year called the Trust Imperative. And the goal of this report was really to take this issue of trust and this issue of privacy and break it into something that's actually practical that we can look at, think about, and use. And you'll see a little bit more of that further on in the webinar. But for now, I really got started on this because I was thinking a lot about that story from several years ago about the pregnant girl who shopped at Target. And she was a teenage girl. She was pregnant. Her parents didn't know. She shopped at Target. Some of you probably know the story, and some of you may not. And then she got sent some coupons, for her next purchase. And the coupons were for things like baby wipes and strollers and all sorts of baby stuff. And her father saw this and, of course, stormed into the Target store, clutching these coupons and said, "Why are you trying to encourage my daughter to get pregnant?" Well, obviously, she was already pregnant. And what had happened in the background was that there was an algorithm that Target was testing out, and the algorithm looked at the shopping cart, and there were 25 products in the shopping cart, and the more of those products that you had in your shopping cart, the higher the probability you were pregnant. Well, what was missing here what they were able to do was actually very precisely identify who was likely to be pregnant. What they were unable to do was identify whether that person wanted to, be marketed to in such a fashion. And so this is just one example of many that you see in the news every single day. Some of them have to do with data breaches that have to do with PII, but a lot of them just have to do with what happens when you take some information and you put it together without context about a person's privacy preferences. And so, in fact, what we're seeing, and this is altimeter research that you're looking at now, is a tremendous amount of distrust and uneasiness about how consumers feel organizations use their data. And there are other studies that are very, very interesting. One is from the Annenberg School of Journalism that came out, I want to say, sometime around the beginning of the summer in June. And the Annenberg study said that, in response basically to people saying, oh, well, millennials don't care about privacy. Nobody cares about privacy anymore. Privacy is dead. People want the benefit of their data being used. Well, what the Annenberg study said was actually people don't necessarily feel that way. What they feel is a sense of resignation, that companies are going to use their data and that they are not really going to have any control over that one way or the other, so they may as well try to get something that they want from it. Now, what's interesting in all of this is that there's been just a phenomenal focus in terms of how we can use customer data to sell, not as much of a focus in terms of how we can use customer data in a way that is actually respectful of the customer. And so if you look at this next slide, this is actually a slide from the Edelman Trust Barometer that comes out every year, and I'd encourage you to look at it if you haven't seen it before, because it looks at trust in various industries over time, and it looks at it, cuts it by chief executives and NGOs and government agencies and consumers, the huge panel and everything. And what they found in their research was that 63% of people would actually stop purchasing from an organization that they did no longer trust. And when we think about the companies in the Fortune 500, just as an example, many of those companies didn't exist 20 years ago. Many of the companies that existed 20 years ago don't exist now, but what we know is that the data landscape has changed so tremendously. And so there's this enormous opportunity not only to use identity as a way of selling things to people, but to use identity and to use ethical data use as a way to deeply understand what people's individual likes and dislikes and needs are around the way that their data is used. And before I turn this back over to Yasha, I just want to add one more point, which is that we're at the very beginning of really understanding, because the industry has galloped along so fast, if you think about this, since the beginning of the social web, which was really only about 10 years ago. If you want to sort of date it from Facebook opening up, and becoming public, is really only beginning to grapple with the implications of all of this stuff that is sort of private, public, semi-private, semi-public. And so we have a ways to go. Yasha, back to you.
No, thank you, Susan, and I couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, what we deal with, I think a lot of people, or some people ask me, well, everybody talks about identity, so what's the deal? Why is it so hard? Everybody says that they do it, but the points that I hope we've laid out and what Susan just said, that we really are at the beginning stages, I think illustrate that this is a challenge for companies. And so what I wanted to get into a little bit is what we think really day in, day out about, which is why this is a hard problem and sort of things that you need to keep in mind, which is building a really solid identity foundation and a framework is hard because consumers change. It really starts at the core around consumers. And so just a few stats out here that I find mind-boggling: 75 million people annually change their phone carriers, or 45 million change their phone numbers. 40 million people, consumers, relocate, or even more astounding to me is 2.1 million people legally change their name. So again, what that means is, what is the beginning point? What is the starting point of your data? Is it out of date or is it not? Are you keeping up with these consumer changes? I recently moved about a month ago. All of my information has changed. How fast is that getting updated through in systems? And so, to me, that's a big challenge. That's what makes really the problem hard. You couple with that, because of some of the TCPA regulations, you couple that publicly available information has declined dramatically in the last 13 years. So taking control of that issue of consumer data constantly changing into your own hands is becoming more difficult and more difficult to sort of accomplish. And so what that really means is that at the end of the day, making data verification is pretty hard across all these different channels and devices, as I mentioned before. The second problem that we face with and we see with our data is that there really is a big data degradation problem. And so the summary of this chart is that if you take 100 records, data records, within a year, you have less than 70%. You've got about 65% accuracy in those 100 records. And so, again, the data that we deal with, that we laid out, all the data elements, the different systems that we got to deal with, the ethical data, best behaviors, all of those culminate also in these three things, sort of come together, that without then on top of that, keeping up to date with all of these data sources becomes a big issue, because you end up with sort of stale consumer identity data. You couple that with what we see, quite frankly, which is an unprecedented data volume. Susan just talked about social data, which and wearables and IoT. I don't even know what those changes are per month. You can see the amount of data that we see in a month changing on what we call traditional identifiers and across name, address, phone, email, IP address. Now, when you think about cookies, right, we see about 5 billion cookies per day, 4 million plus mobile ad IDs per day. We see about 10 plus billion DNS queries per day. All of that volume makes it actually a huge math problem and a computational problem, let alone obviously all of the privacy and the ethical data behavior, practices. And so those three things together really make this a hard problem. And the next slide here is probably something everybody here on the call has seen before. It comes from Forrester, and the data management platform was sort of touted and as the promise for the solution around all of this. And I like to call this, it's partially true and partially false. I would say that the element of identity and resolving identity resolution across all these data sources has morphed this into what I like to call the DMP 2.0. And that really is sort of the missing piece in this. Yes, a DMP can take data, input it through a user interface. It can normalize the data, help segment and score, and basically push out those relevant those audiences, if you will, to relevant live channels. The question really is, if you don't have solid identity data, how are you really making informed decisions on a couple things? Let's set aside really efficiency and marketing spend, but just make sure you're showing the right ad to the right person at the right time, and you're not having an impact sort of on your brand through that experience. And really, so what we're going to get into in the next section, but I wanted to get back to a piece that Susan alluded to, which is really some of the framework that she's put together on how to protect and take into consideration sort of the ethical aspect of data, because clearly this was a great DMP 1.0, but I want to paint a picture of sort of the next phase of this. But before going into that, I wanted Susan to pick it back up, and then we can describe sort of the problems with creating an identity and why you might get confused with everything that's out there in the marketplace.
Thank you. That's quite a setup. I'm going to try to live up to it. So, oopsie, sorry, we skipped ahead too much. So take a look at these principles for ethical data use, and I have to be, completely clear about this. These principles were actually developed by an organization called the Information Accountability Foundation, and this is an industry organization that is actually working on trying to create principles, values, best practices around ethical data use. And you can find this document actually if you go to the Information Accountability Foundation website, and you can download it. This is just a summary, really. It's my summary of their 5 principles. And what's interesting about them is that they start to break down the conversation about what is ethical, which is a very big and very difficult word to pin down, into something that we can actually start to think about in a very pragmatic way. And so the first thing, and we hear about this a lot, and I'll give you some good examples. The first thing is benefit or beneficial. So is the way that we're using data as beneficial to the customer as it is to us? Now, Caesars, and I will tell you this is in my report, Caesars Entertainment actually has a rule that they call the Sunlight Rule, and they will not use data for any purpose unless that data use is as beneficial to the individual as it is to the company. And so you have to start to think about, is the way that we're using data helpful to them as much as it is to us? And you could put anything through this filter. You could start thinking about ad targeting. You could start thinking about ways in which data is being sold to a third party. Is that beneficial to the customer? Well, hard to know. And so it's a really good, series of filters to start to think about. The next piece is progressiveness. And progressiveness is interesting because it really has to do with the organization's responsibility to use data more efficiently over time. And not only to use it more efficiently over time, but to think very carefully about minimizing the amount of data that they need. So, for example, it argues against wholesale data collection. Let's just collect everything and hold it. Now, that will make your average data scientist want to cry, because data scientists love having as much data as possible, because the more data, the more possibility to find adjacencies and outliers and all sorts of interesting things that they can dive into. But the idea here is that, the more data that you have, the more risk that you have, because what if that data is breached? What if that data is stolen? What if that data is used in a way that isn't productive for the consumer? So progressiveness has a lot to do with data minimization, but a lot also to do with just becoming more efficient in the use of data overall. The next piece is around sustainability. And when you think about sensors, this is really interesting, because when you think about the ways in which some data is being collected in the consumer electronics and connected device world, well, sustainability is anathema to devices, because devices tend to obsolesce. And so think about what happened, as one example, with Nike and the fuel band, and when they stopped collecting the fuel band, what happens to that data? A very interesting example of this was when Borders went out of business, and this actually has to do with a different principle. But the idea is that when Borders went out of business, they were looking at their assets, and one of their assets, of course, was their customer records. And so what happens to your data, both in terms of the integrity of that data, the way the data is being stored, but also in terms of how that data is used, and is that a sustainable process over time? So if you're actually trying to sell people, and we see this all the time with devices, right? You buy a device, the data that you had before doesn't work, you have to adapt it in some way, or it's not compatible, not backwards compatible, not forwards compatible. It can be challenging. And when we're talking about very intimate personal data, that can also be problematic if that data is being used in a way that relies on its integrity. The next piece is around respect and respectfulness. Now, this has to do with the way in which we collect data. And if you think about the conversations that we have most frequently about data use and ethics, a lot of the focus is on respect. Did we disclose? So if you look back to what was in the news, say, 3 weeks ago with Windows 10 and Spotify and the new Spotify privacy disclosures and Windows 10, if you go back to what Daniel Ek, who's the CEO of Spotify, said, and also what was said about Windows 10, both companies really said, well, you know, we collect a lot of data, but the real issue is that we didn't communicate well enough about it. And so that's part of it, but there were some other issues as well. So respect is about how you collect that data, how transparent it is. Do you have clear terms of service? Are there appropriate in-app notifications and that sort of thing? And when you tend to see legislation or you tend to see the FTC stepping in, a lot of it has to do with consumer disclosure. And so one of the things I would suggest to you guys is that it's not just about, well, let's disclose to you that we're about to do something with your data that you don't want us to do. Let's look at the entire process of how we use data. One excellent example of respect not being in practice is at JFK Airport, where there's a company that is, and this is my personal opinion, folks, so don't blame don't blame anyone else for it. But you know, my personal opinion here is that JFK now has an app that tells you what your wait time is at the airport. And the way that they tell you what your wait time is at the airport before you go through security is that they're pinging your phone using a beacon device in the airport. And that beacon device is pulling your MAC address off your phone. That's the unique identifier of your phone. They're not telling you that. They are, however, giving you benefits. They pass the benefit test because they're telling you how long you have to wait, but they're failing the respect test because there's no disclosure anywhere that they're taking your MAC address. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that the company and TSA have both said that they are not storing this information, but of course we all know about things such as caches and memory and everything like that. So, you know, the question is, like, can someone have access to that later, which leads us to the fifth principle, which is around fairness. So if respect is around how we collect information, fairness is about what we do with it. So what if somebody, for example, their data is collected because a company wants to develop some new financial products, and so they say, okay, well, I'd like to understand who the retirees are in my local area who have very low savings, because I'm going to target reverse mortgages at them. So fairness has to do with predatory practices. It has to do with not taking data for one use and using it for another that inconveniences or harms the other person. This is something that the Office of Security and Technology Policy in the White House are very concerned with, because they want to make sure that there is no such thing as data discrimination. There is now, for example, predictive policing being used, and you know, not to get political about this, but just the idea is you can think about all the different ways in which data can be gathered, identity can be resolved, and then how that data can be used has tremendous implications. And so so I'm not arguing for not collecting data. What I'm saying is if we're going to do it, we need to be responsible all the way through. And so if you look at this next slide, this takes those principles and then actually breaks them out by the different stages of the data lifecycle. So collection to processing, in other words, how we put information together, how we use maybe public and private data sets or different data sets together. This is kind of a really good, example of, or Target is a really good example of this, as is analytics. What analytics do we use? Who's actually seeing it? At what point are they seeing it? Storage and security. Obviously, security breaches are a huge issue here, but just the question of who can actually where things go and for how long is really interesting too, because, consumers may not want you to have that data for a super long time. Governance, who can see it, who can delete it, who can change it, use it, and, what the rights are that various people have, usage, how we're going to use it, are we going to sell it to a third party, are we just going to keep it for our own use? And then finally, communication, how is all this communicated? So you can see that when you start running through these different topics, that it may in your mind start to alert you to some areas where you have to start thinking about data, ethical data use sort of more strategically. Yasha, you're up.
Thank you. So that was a great overview on sort of what we need to keep in mind to keep the to be respectful and show benefit at the same time. What I wanted to pick up on is this whole notion and discussion around that notion of sort of the evolution of the DMP and the role of identity in it. You're being presented with a lot of alternatives and discussion and presentations on folks who solve and solve identity. And there are DMPs today that offer a unified digital ID, and they do so with a probabilistic cross-device graph. And so they take, they basically take the digital ID and they map it to cookies or to non-browser identifiers. What you will notice here is that what's absent really is any sort of offline data elements. But really the problem in this approach is that because it's done via solely a probabilistic method, you don't have a unifying ID across sort of these clusters, what we call ID clusters. And that's really because there's no identity resolution that's happening around here. And so you end up with these multiple identity clusters. And then I already mentioned that it very much is only focused on in the digital space. We actually interestingly are working with vendors in that space to help them tie this back to sort of the offline world. So then let's take the next step at looking at this and what folks are trying to do, or what around bringing really offline data into the mix. And what I want to talk about is distinguishing between onboarding offline data and creating an identity. Because what you see here, what I try to illustrate with the different colors in blue and purple, is that I, for example, have 4 email addresses, right, for different purposes. I think I saw a study on average now people are like over four emails per person. So at what point, how do we match these offline identifiers to one ID so that we don't have multiple emails per consumer, and we, at the end of the day, then have a limited number of email cookies or non-browser ID linkages, and effectively, if we're just building this via a probabilistic approach, you're going to create a lot of false positives. Because you really don't have that offline identity and the identifiers. So what we're trying to do, and what I think is really important for you and for marketers and the services we have to offer, is to really bring in this identity resolution layer so that we can ingest offline identifiers, onboard them, and match that against an authoritative identity, so that you now can really do 2 things. One is you can increase your understanding of the offline consumer profile, and then both improve your precision and recall rates across devices. And there's some interesting research around precision and recall. And the best way to sort of think about it is that precision is really desirable if you want to, if you sort of want to retarget consumers or an audience in sequential messaging. So if you don't have enough number of these identifiers in an identity cluster, you can't really sequence that because you don't have enough of those identities in that cluster. On the other hand, you also want to build the top of the funnel, and so recall is the number of identities that are actually in this cluster, and that is used to build reach, if that is your goal. So you can see how identity can play a role, or plays a very important role both at the top of the funnel to grow to your reach, and then to drive them through the consumer journey or the buying journey that Susan laid out earlier. And so I just wanted to lay that out there and sort of what folks are trying to do, so that we have a clear picture of what onboarding does. We have a clear picture of sort of what a digital-only probabilistic approach does, and then marrying the best of both worlds. And I believe that you are going to always need to augment deterministic linkages with probabilistic linkages. Maybe the best example just is to say the deterministic linkages are the rocks in a glass, and then you want to fill in that empty space with probabilistic linkages and the sand in there, and create sort of complete the image, if you will, where you don't have enough deterministic linkages. But the point I'm trying to raise is if you just leverage probabilistic linkages, you end up with really not having an identity resolution. And so that again is important if you think about it, because you at the end of the day want to create superior customer experiences, as I pointed out before. And one, yes, that's because you want to drive media efficiency between your known and anonymous interactions. You want to control the message, but obviously you want to balance or control also the customer journey. And that really is connected, and the marketing across those channels is connected via this identity, as I already laid out. And so that is the persistent ID. That is the identity resolution that drives it. That is taking any data source, whether it's CRM data, website data, point of sale data, third-party online or offline data, but it is really unifying all that taxonomy into a single truth, so that you can measure and optimize and really understand who's at the other end of that interaction across your across all these touch points. And so when you think about it, we take an approach where we start with linking at the base 220 million adults and 120 million households, and we've linked those now to 260 million device ad IDs. But that gives you sort of, as I mentioned in my very first slide, that gives you sort of an idea of who that person is. But really, to round out the picture, we append over 16,000 offline and online attributes to around demographic, geographic, psychographic, behavioral traits to give you a better image. But I've already touched on this a little bit, but it's really the accuracy and the validation of the corroboration data that we have, that are inbound daily activity to deal with that consumer data change issue and turnover. And so at the end of the day, with that, we can help marketers leverage data assets, help you amplify that with real insights, but really at the end of the day, get the noise out of big data, get your targeting into high definition, understand who you want to target, build better lookalike modeling, build better active modeling, respect the consumer. To Susan's great point about, okay, so you know, it was great that the basket of goods indicated that the girl was eligible for marketing or suitable for marketing, but did you have enough data in that data set to make maybe better decisions? And really, when you think about that coming together, it solves what I call three fundamental problems. One is bridging offline and online interactions to build those rich customer profiles, and we do that by helping you onboard your data, helping you, and then you can do several things with that. You can analyze markets. You can build rich offline segmentation and customer profiles. You can use that to target folks online. We can turn that into cookie pools. You can take that rich customer data and you can append it to to calls that come in, so that calls are routed to the right agent and the right offers are put in front of them, and obviously to fill out the measurement and attribution efforts that marketers are going through. And so let's take a real quick sort of look at how we build an identity and what's important. And we've talked about, but hopefully a quick review of this will bring it to life a little bit more. But we start with these identifiers, name, address, phone, email, and they really end up creating sort of the set of the fundamental identifiers. But as I alluded to, the problem is that I might get 4 of those. I might get Yasha Ulrich, Yasha Sturmat, Yasha Ulrich Sturmat. And believe you me, I've had many variations on my name throughout my life on that. But the key is to really aggregate and resolve and pick the right name, the right address, the right phone, and the right mobile identifier to create that persistent ID. And you then, you ask yourself, okay, well, what is sort of the secret sauce? And I would say, look, if I haven't bought if I've gone on to a store in the last year, how up to date is my information? If I haven't gone to a store and I'm just relying on CRM-based identity, then you're going to miss the fact that I've changed my address. You're going to miss the fact that I went from a renter to homeowner. And so we believe that that network effect of daily transactional data that we get to see allows us to provide the freshest and most accurate and relevant audience information. And we obviously, we've talked about it, but I want to give a little bit more meat behind how serious we take privacy. It sort of is, if you look at it from a pure product management roadmap, it's like priority 0. We have to adhere to privacy guidelines. We have a chief privacy officer who reviews all practices. Yes, we have, we're certified by NAIA and Trustee, but it's more the approach that we take to building products and the approach to how we respect that. I wanted to sort of finish this by giving you an example of how really we're helping a customer of ours, and this is, in this case, it's Lenovo. And in their first experience, there was no information that was passed in the call to the website, and you can see the conversion numbers and the revenue per numbers. And at the end of the day, we drove, because of the information that we provided, we were able to drive conversion rates by over 40%. So there's real benefit in tying what you're trying to do from a marketing perspective, both inbound, outbound, online, offline, to an authoritative identity. So with that, I think we're at the end of the presentation and to the Q&A session. So how should we? Do we want to tackle the first question?
That sounds great, Yasha. Thank you so much. And great presentation from both of you, Susan and Yasha. Well, we're now ready to open the floor to your questions. As a reminder, to participate in our Q&A, just type your question into the Ask a Question text area and click the Submit button. We've already got a lot of questions already. Yasha, let me feed this first one to you. One of our audience members asked about authoritative identity. What is authoritative identity? And can you give us some examples of how having authoritative identity can help you deliver better marketing, specifically in offline channels, but perhaps also in online channels?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just summarize what I hope we got across in the presentation. An authoritative identity is one that is based on deterministic linkages and what we call offline identifiers. We talked about the data elements, Susan laid out, I laid out, but at the end of the day, it's about identity resolution around the name, the address, a phone number, an email, and that no matter what comes into that, whatever new data comes into that identity platform, we can resolve it to authoritative data that we have. And the use of that is that we know who's at the other end of the conversation. At AK, you mentioned I came from AK, we did a query log of just cookie-based just targeting, and we sometimes saw that that we would see 2 income brackets, 3 age groups, and male and female in the same cookie ID. I don't know how effective that targeting effort is. And so the benefit of authoritative identity is to know to just target better and be more effective in the communication, as well as create that personalized dialogue with your customer and prospect.
Sounds fantastic. Susan, let me ask you this question. One of our attendees asked about specifically ethical data. Can you explain that a little bit more? This attendee's company complies with most self-enforced and legal privacy-related guidelines, but does this ensure that doing this abides by principles of ethical data as highlighted in your presentation? What do you think about that, Susan?
Well, so here's the thing. I, as part of the research, asked some lawyers what they thought, and they came back, 100% of them said no, because the law can't govern all of the unintended consequences. So if you think about, for example, the Target pregnant girl thing, I mean, Target didn't do anything wrong. I mean, at least based on what we knew at the time, it wasn't, this isn't it shouldn't have been it was a scandal because the girl was young and everything, but there was no law that was breached, I don't think. I mean, they weren't collecting PII from a minor, as far as I could tell. And of course, we don't know, like, did she use her own credit card that was in her dad's name? In that case, maybe he got copies of her statements, and maybe he got copies of the promotional materials. So we don't exactly know, at least I don't exactly know what happened there. But the point, if there's another thing you take away, is that there are a lot of unanticipated consequences to the incredible number of data points that are out there about people at any given time. And so once you start mixing and matching them, strange things happen. And so a company could be in perfect compliance with all applicable law everywhere in the world, in a perfect world, and still have an issue because they hadn't thought through the implication of a particular use of data that they were planning to do. And so if nothing else, this framework is intended to help you start thinking through, well, okay, so where are the gotchas? Where are the blind spots that we might have in our organization? Or are there new campaigns or new projects that we're beginning where we want to use data in a way? Let's run it through that filter and see if something strange comes out. And if that happens, then I think that puts you in a position to be able to better plan for what you need to be doing.
Super. Well, thanks for that, Susan. And it looks like now we've reached the end of our time. To all our attendees, if we didn't get to your questions, we'll do our best to follow up with you later. Now, before you go, please feel free to download NEUSTAR'S presentation for this webinar. Now, you can use the green widget below at the far right. So download that now. And also, please take a moment to answer our exit survey so we could get a sense of how we did today. It'll appear shortly. You can also view and listen to this presentation on demand using the same link you used to attend today. You'll get an email soon as this archive is ready. So on behalf of our guests, Susan Entlinger from Altimer Group and Yasha Ulrich-Sturmett from NEUSTAR, this has been Chris Hosford with the Ad Age team. Thanks so much for your time, and have a great and prosperous day.